Good evening and welcome back to Mythic Nightfall. Tonight, we're journeying into the realm of what might have been, into a version of a story you think you know, but reimagined under different stars. Get comfortable wherever you are. Adjust your pillow, pull your blanket a little closer. Let the weight of the day slip away from your shoulders like water running off smooth stone. Close your eyes if you wish, or let them rest softly on something distant and peaceful. Take a deep breath in through your nose, hold it for just a moment, and then release it slowly through your mouth. Feel your body sinking a little deeper into whatever surface supports you. Tonight, we're returning to ancient Crete, to a time when the Aegean Sea was not just water, but a highway connecting kingdoms and cultures, when myths were living stories that people believed as truth. We're going to a tower that rises above the wine-dark sea, but the story that unfolds will be different from the one carved into stone and repeated through the ages. This is the story of Icarus, yes, but not the Icarus who fell. This is the story of the night he learned to fly properly, the night his father's genius triumphed completely, the night when wisdom and wonder walked hand in hand across the starlit sky. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. And if this is your first time here, welcome to a place where myths find new endings, where ancient stories breathe with possibilities. Now, settle in deeper. Let's begin. The tower, above the sea. The island of Crete in the Bronze Age was a place of profound contradictions. By day, the palace of Knossos gleamed white in the Mediterranean sun, its corridors winding like the legendary labyrinth that Daedalus himself had designed. The palace complex sprawled across the hillside, a maze of chambers and courtyards, storage rooms filled with enormous clay jars of olive oil and wine, workshops where artisans created pottery painted with octopuses and dolphins, throne rooms where King Minos held court beneath frescoes of bull leapers and priestesses. By night, those same walls cast shadows that seemed to hold secrets, whispers of the Minotaur that once dwelled in the depths below, of Theseus and his thread, of King Minos and his complicated legacy. The palace at night was a different place entirely, lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows, filled with the sounds of guards making their rounds, of servants preparing for the next day, of the wind whistling through the light wells and corridors. But our story takes place in a different part of that complex, in a tower that overlooked the northern sea. Here, in rooms that might have been comfortable had they not been a prison, lived Daedalus and his son Icarus. The tower wasn't dark or damp like a dungeon. King Minos wasn't a monster in the traditional sense, merely a king who understood that knowledge could be dangerous when it walked free. Daedalus knew the secrets of the labyrinth, knew its turnings and its heart, knew which passages led to dead ends and which led to the center where the Minotaur had once lived before Theseus killed it. Minos could not risk that knowledge sailing away to Athens or Sparta or any of the rival kingdoms that dotted the Aegean like stars in the night sky. So Daedalus lived in his tower with his son, and he had time. Time to think, time to observe, time to perfect the craft that had made him legendary throughout the Greek world. Daedalus was not young anymore. His beard had gone gray at the temples, and his hands, though still steady and sure, bore the calluses and scars of a lifetime spent shaping wood and stone and bronze into objects of beauty and function. He had built automatons that moved as if alive, their bronze joints so cunningly crafted that they could turn their heads and move their limbs with eerie smoothness. He had carved statues so lifelike that people swore they breathed, that they might step down from their pedestals at any moment. He had designed the labyrinth itself, that impossible maze that had no equal anywhere in the known world, a structure so complex that even he, its creator, had needed Ariadne's thread to navigate it safely. But none of those achievements, impressive as they were, consumed his thoughts as completely as what he observed each morning from his tower window. Birds, hundreds of them, thousands of them, gulls mostly, wheeling and crying over the water, their wings bright white against the deep blue of the Mediterranean sky. Their calls echoed off the palace walls, a constant soundtrack to life by the sea. Sometimes eagles would appear, magnificent birds with wings spread wide, riding the thermals that rose from the sun-warmed cliffs without seeming to move at all, just spiraling upward in lazy circles, climbing higher and higher until they were mere specks against the blue. Occasionally, smaller birds would dart past, sparrows and finches and swallows, their movements quick and precise, turning on invisible currents of air with an agility that seemed to defy the laws of nature. Icarus would join his father at the window most mornings. His son was young, perhaps 16 or 17 summers, with the lean build of youth and eyes that still held wonder rather than the wariness that came with age and experience. Unlike his father, Icarus had no real memories of freedom, no experience of walking the streets of Athens as a free man, no memories of sailing between the islands as a passenger rather than a prisoner. He had grown up in this tower, and while he sometimes felt the ache of confinement, the longing for something beyond these walls, he had also learned patience from his father. He had learned to find interest in small things, to observe closely, to think deeply. "The gulls ride the wind," Icarus observed one morning, his voice quiet with concentration, watching a particularly graceful bird soar past their window without seeming to move its wings at all. The gull simply held its wings extended, angled just so, and the invisible currents of air carried it forward and upward. They don't always flap. Sometimes they just glide, like they're being carried by something we can't see. Daedalus nodded slowly, that particular nod he gave when an idea was taking shape in his mind like clay on a potter's wheel, still formless but with potential. "The wind does the work for them," he said, his voice thoughtful, distant, already beginning to calculate and design. "They've learned to read it, to feel where it rises and where it falls, where it's strong and where it's weak. They're not fighting against nature, Icarus. They're dancing with it. They're partners with the air itself." This observation, simple as it was, would change everything that followed. You see, Daedalus had already been planning their escape for many months. He'd been gathering feathers with obsessive attention, carefully collecting them from the tower's battlements where birds roosted at night, trading little gifts to the guards for feathers from the palace's chicken coops and goose pens, even plucking them from the pillows and cushions in their rooms when the old ones were thrown out to be restuffed. He'd been hoarding beeswax too, precious and golden, obtained in small amounts from the candles that lit their chambers at night, scraping it carefully from the sides of the holders, saving every tiny bit. But his initial designs had been flawed, and he knew it even as he sketched them on pieces of parchment with charcoal, trying to imagine how they would work in practice. Wings like a bird's wings, yes, but built for human strength and human proportions, meant to be flapped with human arms the way a bird flapped its wings. The energy required would be enormous. A man would exhaust himself within minutes, maybe even faster. And that was assuming the wings could even generate enough lift, which his calculations and his understanding of proportions and forces told him was doubtful at best. The problem had gnawed at him for months, keeping him awake at night, filling his dreams with images of falling, of wings that wouldn't work, of freedom just out of reach. Until that morning with Icarus at the window, watching the gull glide effortlessly on an invisible current of rising air. What if, Daedalus thought, his mind suddenly racing with possibilities? What if we don't try to fly like a bird that flaps? What if we try to fly like a bird that soars? What if we work with the wind instead of fighting against it? The engineering of flight. The work began in earnest after that revelation. But it was slow work, methodical work, the kind of painstaking effort that defined Daedalus's genius and had made him legendary. He was not a man who rushed. He was not a man who took shortcuts or hoped that things would work out if he just tried hard enough. When Daedalus built something, he built it to last, to work perfectly, to be flawless in its execution. That's what separated a true master craftsman from someone who merely had skill with their hands. First came what Daedalus thought of as the study phase, and it lasted for weeks. He spent entire days doing nothing but watching birds, noting everything he could observe in meticulous detail. He watched how they angled their wings to catch updrafts, tilting them ever so slightly to redirect the force of rising air into forward motion and additional lift. He observed how they shifted individual feathers, using them almost like fingers to steer and stabilize, making tiny adjustments constantly. He noticed how different birds had different wing shapes, optimized for different types of flight. Eagles had broad wings with splayed primary feathers for soaring. Sparrows had shorter, more rounded wings for quick turns and rapid acceleration. Swallows had long, pointed wings for sustained, efficient flight. He filled page after page with sketches and notes, his careful hand drawing wing profiles from every angle, noting measurements and proportions, calculating ratios. Wingspan compared to body weight. The curve of the wing from leading edge to trailing edge, that crucial airfoil shape. The way birds would tuck their legs up close to their bodies to reduce drag when flying fast, or spread their tail feathers wide to slow down for landing, using them like a ship's rudder and brake combined. Icarus helped with these observations, and gradually he learned to see what his father saw, to notice details that would have escaped his attention before. They would spend hours on the tower roof, which became their laboratory and observatory, Icarus calling out observations while Daedalus sketched and calculated and refined his understanding. The eagle never fights the wind, Icarus noted one afternoon, his eyes tracking a magnificent bird that spiraled upward without seeming to move at all, just hanging in the sky like it was suspended by invisible strings. It just keeps turning in these slow circles, and it rises higher and higher. How does it know where to turn? It's found a thermal, Daedalus explained, his own eyes following the bird's path with intense focus, mentally measuring angles and rates of climb. A column of rising air, warmed by the sun heating the ground or the rocks. The eagle knows how to find them, how to feel them in the air against its feathers. It can sense the temperature change, the slight push of air moving upward. We'll need to learn that too, to feel those invisible currents. Our lives may depend on it. The design that emerged from all this patient observation was revolutionary, though Daedalus wouldn't have thought of it that way. He was simply solving a problem, applying everything he knew about materials and forces and proportions to create something functional. But the result was unlike anything that had been attempted before. He sketched wings that were far larger than he'd originally planned, great sweeping structures that would give maximum surface area with minimum weight. The frame would be made from the lightest wood he could find, thin strips of willow that he'd been carefully saving and aging, laminated together with fish glue for strength without adding unnecessary weight. He would build in flexibility too, joints that would allow the wing to twist and flex the way a bird's wing did, rather than being rigid and brittle. But the real genius, the true innovation, was in how he planned to use the feathers. Daedalus didn't just plan to stick feathers onto the frame randomly, the way someone might decorate a costume. He studied every single feather he'd collected over the months, sorting them carefully by size, shape, and stiffness. He learned that feathers were remarkably sophisticated structures, far more complex than they appeared at first glance. The long, strong primary feathers, the ones that came from the tips of a bird's wings, would go at the wingtips, where they would provide the main lifting surface and allow for precise control of flight direction. These feathers were asymmetrical, with a leading edge that was narrower and stiffer than the trailing edge, which helped them cut through the air efficiently. The secondary feathers, shorter and more flexible, would cover the central portion of the wing, creating that crucial airfoil shape that made flight possible. The curved upper surface that made air move faster over the top of the wing than the bottom, creating lower pressure above and higher pressure below, generating lift. The coverts, the smallest feathers, would be layered carefully over the frame in overlapping rows like roof tiles, creating a smooth surface that prevented air from slipping through gaps and reducing the turbulence that would slow them down. The attachment method was absolutely critical, perhaps the most important element of the entire design. Simply gluing feathers to a frame with beeswax, as the traditional stories would later describe, wouldn't be nearly strong enough or reliable enough. The wax would be part of the system, yes, but not the primary attachment. Daedalus developed a sophisticated multi-layered approach. First, he drilled tiny holes through the willow frame using a small bronze awl heated in a candle flame to char the wood and make drilling easier. Then he threaded each feather's quill through these holes, securing it with tight wrapping of thin linen thread, the kind used for the finest weaving. Over the thread, he applied a dab of glue made from boiling fish bones and animal hide, letting it dry completely. Finally, he sealed everything with a coating of beeswax that had been carefully purified by melting it multiple times and straining out impurities. This method had multiple advantages. The thread and glue provided the primary structural attachment, strong and reliable. The wax served as a weatherproof coating and helped lock everything in place, but it wasn't bearing the full weight and stress of the feathers. If the wax softened in sunlight or with body heat, the feathers would still hold firm. It was redundancy built into every element, multiple systems backing each other up, the way a good engineer always designs things. But Daedalus went even further. He understood from watching birds that wings needed to flex and twist to work properly, that a rigid wing was actually less efficient than one that could adjust its shape to match changing air conditions. So he designed joints into the frame itself. Near what would be the wearer's shoulder, the wing had a main spar that connected to a harness he was also designing. But that connection point could rotate, allowing the wing to adjust its angle of attack. Further out along the wing's length, secondary joints allowed different sections to adjust their angle independently. It was a complex system, elegant in its complexity, operated by a series of thin but strong ropes made from twisted linen fibers, ropes that would run along the wing and connect to the flyer's hands and arms. "It's like controlling a sail on a ship," Daedalus explained to Icarus as he demonstrated the mechanism with a partial wing he'd built as a test model. His hands moved over the control ropes, showing how each one affected different parts of the wing. "Pull this rope, and the wingtips angle up, which will make you climb. The increased angle catches more air and redirects the force upward. Release it and pull this one, and you bank to the left. The wing on the left decreases its angle, while the right increases, creating asymmetric lift. You'll control your flight not with brute strength, but with precision and understanding. Finesse, not force." The construction took many months, far longer than Daedalus had originally anticipated. But he refused to rush, refused to compromise on quality for the sake of speed. Their lives would depend on these wings working perfectly on the first attempt. There would be no second chances. Every evening, by the flickering light of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, Daedalus and Icarus would work together in their tower room. The work became a kind of meditation, a peaceful ritual that marked the passage of time. Icarus learned to tie the special knots his father had designed, knots that tightened under stress but could still be adjusted when needed. He learned to thread feathers through the holes in the frame with infinite patience, taking sometimes an hour to properly position and secure a single primary feather. He learned to apply just the right amount of wax, heating it carefully until it was soft enough to spread, but not so hot that it damaged the feathers, spreading it evenly so it sealed without adding unnecessary weight. There were failures along the way, learning experiences that Daedalus treated not as setbacks, but as valuable information. An early test of a wing section, suspended from the ceiling and loaded with weights to simulate the forces it would experience, showed that Daedalus had made the frame too rigid. It couldn't flex enough and eventually snapped under stress. He redesigned it, adding more joints, making the frame lighter but more flexible. Another test revealed that the feathers he'd used on one section were too soft, and they bent instead of holding their shape against the wind pressure. He carefully removed them and replaced them with stiffer primary feathers from larger birds. Each failure taught them something. Each iteration brought them closer to perfection. But slowly, so slowly, two pairs of wings took shape. They grew from ideas to sketches, to prototypes, to refined designs, to actual, functional wings. They were beautiful objects in their own way, these wings. Not like bird wings, not exactly, but something new and unique, a marriage of human ingenuity and natural perfection. They gleamed in the lamplight, the feathers catching and reflecting the flame in subtle ways, creating patterns of light and shadow. The wax coating gave them a subtle luster, and when Daedalus spread one of the completed wings, it was almost 8 feet from tip to base, a magnificent structure that seemed both delicate and strong. When both pairs were finally complete, when every feather was in place and every joint tested and every rope checked and double-checked, Daedalus spent another 2 full weeks just testing them on the ground. He built a harness that would distribute the weight properly across the wearer's shoulders and chest, using wide straps of soft leather padded with wool so they wouldn't chafe during hours of flight. The harness had to be comfortable but secure, had to allow full range of motion while keeping the wings firmly attached, had to be something you could wear for many hours without it becoming unbearable. He checked every knot, every feather, every joint in the frame multiple times. He tested the control ropes hundreds and hundreds of times, pulling them in every combination, making sure they moved smoothly through their guides and wouldn't bind or snap under stress. He hung the wings from the ceiling and loaded them with weights, subjecting them to forces greater than they would experience in actual flight, watching for any signs of weakness or failure. Only when he was completely satisfied, when he had tested everything he could possibly test, did he move on to the most important phase of all, teaching Icarus how to fly. The training of a flyer. Daedalus did not simply hand Icarus the wings and tell him to leap from the tower. That would have been madness, the act of a reckless man or a desperate one, and Daedalus was neither. He was methodical. He was patient. He had spent too much time building these wings, had invested too much of himself in them to throw everything away with careless haste. And more importantly, this was his son, his only child, the person he loved most in all the world. He would not risk Icarus's life by rushing this crucial phase. The training began on the tower roof under the warm Mediterranean sun, with no flight at all, just standing, just getting used to the equipment. Icarus would wear the harness with the wings folded against his back, and Daedalus would have him practice the control movements over and over. Pull this rope to adjust the wing angle. Shift your weight to bank left or right. Feel the tension in the ropes. Learn how much force each adjustment required. Understand which muscles you'd need to use and how to use them efficiently without exhausting yourself. Flying, Daedalus told his son, his voice serious but patient, is not about strength. Oh, strength helps, certainly, but it's not the key to success. Flying is about feeling, about developing an instinctive understanding of how the wings respond to your inputs. You need to become one with the wings, to the point where adjusting them is as natural as moving your own arms or turning your head. You don't think about how to walk, do you? Your body just knows. After enough practice, after enough repetition, flying needs to become the same. Your body needs to know what to do before your mind can even form the thought. They practiced for hours each day, sometimes in the cool of morning, sometimes in the golden light of late afternoon. Icarus would stand on the roof with the wings strapped to his back, eyes closed to focus entirely on the feel of the controls, while Daedalus called out commands in a steady rhythm. Bank left, climb, level out, descend slowly, turn right, climb again. And Icarus would make the adjustments, his hands moving on the control ropes, his arms and shoulders working against the resistance of the folded wings, building muscle memory, learning the subtle differences between each control input, understanding how much pressure was too much and how much was too little. After a week of this ground training, after the movements had started to become automatic, they moved on to the next phase, actual flight practice, though approached with characteristic caution. On days when the wind was steady and not too strong, when conditions were as close to ideal as possible, Daedalus would have Icarus stand on the tower's lower battlements, just 10 feet off the ground above a soft patch of sand that had been brought in and spread in the courtyard below, specifically for this purpose. Icarus would spread his wings, feeling them catch the air, and then step forward. It wasn't really flight, not at first, more like controlled falling. But in that brief moment between stepping off the battlement and landing in the sand below, Icarus felt something magical. He felt the wings catch the air with a sound like wind through trees, felt them provide resistance, slow his fall, give him that moment of gliding. And in that moment, however brief, he wasn't touching the ground. He was suspended in air, held up by nothing but cleverness and feathers and the invisible support of moving air. The first few landings were rough. Icarus came down too fast, his knees not bent enough to absorb the impact, stumbling forward into the sand. But Daedalus was patient, offering corrections without criticism. Bend your knees more before you touch down. Flare the wings at the last moment to catch more air and slow your descent. Keep your body upright. Don't lean forward. Again, Icarus would climb back up the steps, adjust his technique based on his father's advice, and try again, and again, and again, dozens of times each day. Gradually, he developed the feel for it. He learned to sense when he was about to touch down and make that final adjustment with the wings, flaring them at just the right moment. He learned to land with bent knees and good balance, touching down smoothly and staying on his feet. After he had mastered the 10-foot glide, they moved to a higher starting point, then higher still. From the lower battlements to the middle ones, then to the top of the tower itself, each increase in height bringing both greater challenge and greater reward. The flights grew longer as Icarus's understanding deepened. He wasn't just falling anymore. He was learning to read the wind, to feel where it wanted to take him, and how to work with those desires. He discovered that by angling his wings just slightly differently, he could extend his glide, stay in the air longer, travel further before he had to land. He learned to feel the subtle variations in air pressure that indicated an updraft, a column of rising air that he could use to maintain altitude or even gain height. One afternoon, starting from the highest point of the tower, he caught a particularly strong thermal. Instead of gliding smoothly down to the courtyard as he'd done dozens of times before, he suddenly found himself rising, actually climbing, gaining altitude, the tower falling away beneath him instead of the ground rising up to meet him. His heart leaped in his chest, not with fear, but with pure exhilaration. He was actually flying. The moment lasted perhaps 15 seconds before the thermal weakened and he resumed his normal glide path. But those 15 seconds changed everything. He had felt true flight, had experienced what it was like to be held aloft, not by artificial support, but by the natural forces of moving air. He landed in the courtyard with a huge smile on his face, and Daedalus, watching from above, allowed himself a small smile as well. But the older man's smile faded quickly, replaced by the serious expression of a teacher who knows his student has just reached a dangerous point in their education. The point where confidence might outpace ability. "That was excellent, Icarus," Daedalus said when he'd climbed down to join his son. "You felt the thermal and used it. That's exactly what you need to be able to do. But let me be very clear about something, and I need you to truly hear this and remember it." He placed both hands on Icarus's shoulders, looking him directly in the eyes. That moment of exhilaration you just felt, that rush of excitement when you found yourself climbing instead of falling, that feeling is both the greatest tool you'll have and the greatest danger you'll face. It can give you the confidence and joy you need to truly master flight. But it can also make you careless. It can make you think you're more capable than you actually are. It can lead you to take risks that aren't worth taking, to push boundaries that should not be pushed. "I understand, Father," Icarus said, his smile fading into a more sober expression. "I won't let excitement override judgment." "See that you don't," Daedalus replied, "because when we make our actual escape, there will be no soft sand to land in if something goes wrong. There will only be the sea, and the sea does not forgive mistakes." They continued training for several more weeks, but now with an added component, night flying. Because that was when they would make their escape under cover of darkness, when the guards were drowsy and the chance of being spotted was minimal. But flying at night presented its own challenges, different from daytime flight in ways that Daedalus knew they needed to prepare for. The first night flight was terrifying for Icarus. The familiar courtyard looked entirely different in darkness, lit only by torches that cast uncertain light and deep shadows. When he stepped off the battlement, he couldn't see the ground rushing up to meet him, couldn't judge his height or his rate of descent with the same accuracy he'd developed during daylight practice. He landed hard, harder than he had in weeks, his ankle twisting painfully, though not, thankfully, spraining. "Night takes away your eyes," Daedalus explained, helping his son up. "So you must learn to use your other senses more. Feel the wind against your face to judge your speed. Listen to the sound the air makes as it flows over the wings. Trust the sensations in your body, the way your stomach feels as you rise or fall. Your eyes will deceive you in darkness, but your body knows the truth." They practiced at night whenever possible, and gradually Icarus adapted. He learned to trust his other senses, learned to fly by feel rather than sight. And strangely, he found that he actually preferred night flying in some ways. There was something peaceful about it, something meditative about being suspended in darkness, with only the stars above and the sound of wind in feathers below. But Daedalus also taught him about the dangers they would face, and he taught these lessons thoroughly and seriously. "The sun," Daedalus said one evening, as they sat together on the roof, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold and purple, "is both friend and enemy to a flyer. Do you know why?" Icarus thought about it, remembering everything his father had taught him about how birds used thermals created by the sun's heat. "Because it warms the air, creating the rising currents we need to gain altitude, but also," he paused, thinking harder, "also because it can heat the wax in the wings?" "Exactly right," his father confirmed with a nod of approval. "Not to melting, not with the design I've created. I've tested that thoroughly. The wax won't melt unless it's held directly in a flame or in truly extreme heat. But the sun can warm it enough to make it softer, which means the wings become slightly less rigid, slightly less responsive to control inputs. It also creates unstable air, turbulent conditions that are harder to fly through. So we must be aware of the sun's position and power at all times." "Then we fly at night," Icarus suggested, the solution seeming obvious. When the air is cool and stable, Daedalus smiled, pleased that his son was thinking ahead. "Exactly. The night is our ally in multiple ways. The guards are less vigilant in darkness, drowsy from a long day. Once we're away from the tower, once we're out over the open sea, who will see us against the black sky? We'll be invisible, like owls hunting in silence. And the cooler air of night will keep the wax firm and the winds more predictable. We'll save the challenges of flying in daylight for the very end, when we're almost to safety and can afford to take more risks." So they refined their plan with careful attention to every detail. They would wait for a night with good weather, when the stars were bright enough to navigate by but the moon was not too full, because too much moonlight might give them away to any guards who happened to look up. They would leave just after midnight, when even the most dedicated sentries were struggling to stay awake, when the palace was at its quietest, and they would fly not toward the east, where the sun would rise and where King Minos's fastest ships could pursue them most easily, but northwest, toward Sicily, The journey was longer, yes, much longer, than if they'd gone to the nearest land. But Sicily was beyond Minos's reach, beyond the network of alliances and obligations that might force other kingdoms to return escaped prisoners. And the route would keep them over water and away from the many inhabited islands where spotters might see them and send word back to Crete. The weeks of training had transformed Icarus in ways that went beyond just physical conditioning. Yes, his arms and shoulders had grown stronger from controlling the wings during countless practice flights. His reflexes sharpened, his balance improved. But more importantly, his mind had developed an intuitive understanding of flight that went beyond anything Daedalus could explicitly teach him. Icarus had become one with the wings in the way his father had hoped, the way that separates someone who merely knows how to do something from someone who truly understands it at a deep, instinctive level. And finally, inevitably, the night came. The weather was perfect, clear skies with excellent visibility, but no moon. Moderate winds from the south that would help push them northwest toward their destination. Air temperature cool enough to keep the wax firm and stable. They had practiced until practice became second nature. They had prepared for every contingency they could imagine. Daedalus laid out the wings on the tower roof one final time, performing a last inspection by lamplight. He checked each feather, running his fingers along them to feel for any looseness or damage. He tested each joint in the frame, flexing them gently to ensure they moved smoothly. He pulled on each control rope, checking for fraying or weakness. Everything was perfect. Everything was ready. He helped Icarus into his harness first, adjusting the straps until they fit perfectly, not too tight, but snug enough that nothing would shift during flight. The wings folded back against the boy's shoulders, manageable in their folded state, but ready to spread wide when the moment came to fly. "Remember everything I've taught you," Daedalus said, his voice steady but filled with emotion as he placed his hands on his son's shoulders one final time. "Trust the wings. They're strong enough. I've built them well. Trust the air. It will support you if you work with it rather than fighting against it. And trust yourself. You've trained well. You're ready for this. If you feel uncertain, if something doesn't feel right, descend and land on any piece of land you can find. Better to walk for a time than to fall. Do you understand?" "I understand, Father," Icarus replied. There was no fear in his eyes now, only calm determination tempered with appropriate respect for the challenge ahead. "I'm ready." Daedalus strapped on his own wings, feeling their familiar weight settle onto his shoulders, the harness distributing the load across his back and chest. He was older than his son, not as strong, but he had something Icarus didn't yet possess. Decades of understanding how materials and forces interacted, how to read situations and adapt to the unexpected, how to stay calm when things didn't go according to plan. If something went wrong during their flight, his experience might mean the difference between life and death for both of them. The tower was quiet around them, wrapped in the deep silence that settles over everything in the hours after midnight. The guards had made their final rounds of the evening and retired to the gatehouse below, where they would be playing dice and fighting sleep until dawn. The palace beyond was dark, lit only by a few scattered oil lamps burning in corridors and chambers where they were never allowed to fully go out. The sea stretched before them, black and vast, dotted here and there with the tiny lights of fishing boats whose crews worked through the night. "Are you ready?" Daedalus asked one final time, though he already knew the answer. Icarus nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Then spread your wings, my son. Let us fly." The first moments of flight The moment when Icarus spread his wings for the first time in their full glory, standing on the edge of the tower roof, with the cool night breeze catching the hundreds of carefully arranged feathers, was a moment that would stay with him forever, would define everything that came after. There was power there, potential energy waiting to be released, the promise of freedom contained in wood and feathers and wax and human ingenuity. The wings extended with a sound like wind through canvas, a rushing whisper that spoke of forces barely contained, of capability waiting to be tested. They stretched out on either side of him, these magnificent structures that his father had spent months creating, each one nearly 8 feet from base to tip, covered in overlapping layers of feathers that caught the starlight and seemed almost to glow with their own inner light. Daedalus spread his wings too, and for a heartbeat they stood side by side, father and son, their great wings extended, catching the starlight and the gentle wind that blew in from the sea. They must have looked like gods in that moment, or like the giant birds of legend, creatures that existed in the space between myth and reality, ready to take their place among the stars. "Remember," Daedalus said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the sound of wind and feathers. "Let the wind lift you. Don't jump. Don't try to leap into the air with your legs. Step forward with confidence, but not force, and trust the wings to catch you. They will. I promise you they will." Icarus took a breath, feeling his heart beating fast but steady in his chest, feeling the adrenaline flooding his system, but not letting it overwhelm his training or his judgment. He'd done this dozens of times in practice, though never from this height, never at night, never with so much at stake, never with actual freedom waiting on the other side of the fear. But the wings felt good, felt right. He could sense the air currents flowing over and around him, could feel how the wings wanted to catch that air and rise. He stepped forward, and the tower's edge disappeared beneath his foot, and for a moment he was falling, dropping into the darkness below. And then the wings caught the air with that distinctive sound, that rushing whisper he'd come to know so well, and he was gliding, descending, yes, but also moving forward. And then he made a subtle adjustment with the control ropes, and the descent stopped, and he was actually climbing, actually rising through the night air, the tower falling away beneath him, rather than rushing up to meet him in fatal impact. The wings worked. By all the gods, the wings actually worked. Behind him, he heard his father's wings catch the air as well, heard that same rushing whisper multiplied, and then Daedalus was beside him, gliding smoothly through the darkness, his form a familiar shape against the stars, his wings spread wide and steady. They flew in silence at first, both of them, focusing intensely on the mechanics of flight, on maintaining altitude and direction. Icarus's hands moved constantly on the control ropes, making tiny adjustments in response to shifts in the wind, to changes in air pressure, to the feel of the wings against the moving air. It was exactly as his father had taught him, constant small corrections rather than large dramatic movements, subtle touches rather than forceful pulls. The tower fell away behind them, shrinking with distance, its torches growing dimmer and then disappearing entirely as they put more space between themselves and their prison. The lights of Knossos' palace dimmed and faded. The coastline of Crete became a dark line against the slightly lighter darkness of the sea. Soon there was nothing but the night sky above them, filled with more stars than Icarus had ever imagined could exist, and the dark sea below, and the two of them suspended between, held aloft by cunning and feathers and the invisible support of moving air. It was only after perhaps 10 or 15 minutes of flight, when they'd put enough distance between themselves and Crete that the risk of being spotted from shore was minimal, that Icarus let himself truly feel the wonder of what they were doing. Let the reality of it penetrate past the focused concentration required for basic flight. He was flying, actually flying through the night sky. Not falling with style, not gliding helplessly toward an inevitable landing with no control over where or how, but truly flying, controlling his path through three-dimensional space with precision and purpose. Every small adjustment he made with the control ropes resulted in an immediate, predictable response from the wings. He could climb by increasing his angle of attack, tilting the wings up to catch more air and redirect it downward. He could descend by decreasing the angle, making the wings more horizontal. He could turn left or right by banking, by creating asymmetric lift between the two wings. He could even slow down by angling the wings more steeply, catching more air resistance, trading speed for more time in the air. The night around them was not completely dark, not the absolute blackness he'd sometimes imagined when thinking about this flight. The stars provided more light than he'd expected, enough that he could see the surface of the water below him, could make out the occasional whitecap where wind stirred the waves into foam. The Mediterranean in late summer was relatively calm, the waves rolling rather than breaking, but still there was motion down there, constant movement that reminded him that water was not a forgiving surface to land on if something went wrong. The air at this height, perhaps 300 or 400 feet above the sea, was cool and fresh, carrying the clean salt smell of deep ocean, rather than the coastal scent of seaweed and fish that he'd grown accustomed to from the tower. There was a taste to it, a quality that spoke of vastness and freedom, of spaces larger than any he'd known before. He breathed it in deeply, filling his lungs, feeling more alive than he could ever remember feeling. Daedalus glided closer, adjusting his flight path so they were flying nearly wingtip to wingtip, close enough to talk without shouting. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the quiet night, competition coming only from the sound of wind moving over their wings. "How do you feel?" his father asked, and there was pride in his voice, unmistakable pride at seeing his creation work so perfectly, at seeing his son master something so difficult. "Like I was meant for this," Icarus replied honestly, and it was true. The fear he'd felt during the early training flights, that uncertainty about whether the wings would actually work, whether his skills would be sufficient, all of that was gone now, replaced by a profound sense of rightness. The wings didn't feel like foreign objects strapped to his back anymore. They felt like extensions of his own body, like he'd been born with them and only now discovered them. "The wings feel like part of me, Father, like I'm not wearing them but have become them." "Good," his father said, satisfaction evident in his tone. "That's exactly how it should feel. That's the difference between someone who's merely learned to use a tool and someone who's achieved true mastery. Now, we need to establish our course. Do you see Polaris?" He pointed with one hand toward a bright star in the northern sky, steady and unwavering, while all the other stars seemed to slowly wheel around it. "Keep that star to our right, just off your right wingtip, and we'll be heading northwest, directly towards Sicily. We have a very long flight ahead of us, many hours through the night and into morning, so we must be efficient with our energy and watchful for fatigue. The moment you feel tired, truly tired, you tell me. Do you understand?" "I understand," Icarus confirmed, adjusting his heading slightly to bring Polaris to the correct position relative to his flight path. They settled into a rhythm after that, a pattern of flight that would carry them through the long hours ahead. The flight was not constant work, which was the true genius of Daedalus's design, the innovation that made a journey of this length possible at all. Once they found a good altitude with steady winds, typically between 300 and 500 feet above the water, they could glide for long stretches with minimal adjustments, letting the wings do the work while they rested their muscles and conserved their strength for when more active flying would be required. The control ropes required only light pressure to adjust, gentle pulls rather than forceful yanking, fingertip control rather than arm wrestling with the wings. Daedalus had calculated the leverage ratios perfectly, had designed the system so that small inputs from the flyer resulted in larger movements of the wing surfaces. Mechanical advantage built into every element. Every so often, they would encounter what Daedalus had taught Icarus to recognize as a thermal, a column of rising air warmed by residual heat from the day's sun, radiating back up from the sea or from islands they passed near. These thermals were treasures to be exploited, gifts from nature that a wise flyer used to his advantage. By circling within them, just as the eagles did during the day, they could gain altitude with almost no effort at all, just making gentle banking turns to stay within the column of rising air, spiraling upward in lazy circles, climbing higher and higher until the thermal weakened, or they reached an altitude where the air became too thin to support comfortable breathing. Then, with altitude gained, they could glide forward for long distances, trading height for forward progress in the most efficient exchange possible, losing perhaps 100 feet of altitude for every 1,000 feet they traveled horizontally, a glide ratio that would have been impossible to achieve with any wing design that depended on flapping for lift. Icarus learned to feel these thermals before he could see any visual sign of them, learned to recognize them by subtle cues that his body picked up before his conscious mind could process them. A certain warmth against his face, a slight flushing of his cheeks as blood vessels dilated in response to temperature increase. A subtle change in the air's texture, the way it felt moving past his skin. A sensation of lift beneath the wings, a gentle push upward that required no effort on his part. His father had told him to watch for such signs during their planning sessions, but experiencing them directly was entirely different from hearing about them in the abstract. This was knowledge that lived in the body, not the mind, wisdom written in nerves and muscles rather than words on parchment. As they flew through the deepest part of the night, Icarus found his awareness expanding, his consciousness stretching to encompass more than just the immediate task of staying aloft. He began to notice details he'd been too focused to see before, aspects of this experience that would stay with him forever. The stars, for instance. From the tower in Crete, looking up at the night sky, the stars had been beautiful but distant, points of light that seemed impossibly far away, unreachable. But here, flying through the darkness at altitude, they seemed closer somehow, more immediate. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of pale light, like milk spilled across black cloth, and Icarus found himself staring up at it in wonder, nearly forgetting to watch his heading. Eyes forward, Daedalus reminded him gently, noticing his son's wandering attention. The stars will still be there later. Right now, focus on maintaining course and altitude. Icarus brought his attention back to the task at hand, checking Polaris's position, adjusting slightly to correct for wind drift. But he couldn't help stealing glances upward when he could spare the attention, awed by the sheer number of stars visible from this new perspective. Below them, the sea revealed its own secrets. They passed over fishing boats, their oil lamps bright pinpricks on the dark water, tiny islands of light in the vast darkness. Icarus wondered what the fishermen would think if they looked up and saw two large shapes passing overhead, wondered if they would even believe their eyes, or if they would dismiss it as a trick of exhaustion or too much wine. He watched dolphins breaking the surface far below, their movements leaving trails of phosphorescence in the water, living light that marked their passage, a phenomenon he'd heard about but never seen from the tower. Once, perhaps 2 hours into their flight, they glimpsed an island in the distance, a dark mass rising from the sea, its mountains silhouetted against the stars, a shape blacker than the night around it. "That's Santorini," Daedalus said, noting the direction of Icarus's gaze. "We'll pass north of it. The island still bears the scars of that terrible eruption that happened decades before you were born. They say the ash cloud darkened the sky for days, that the explosion could be heard as far away as Egypt. The waves that followed destroyed cities all along the coast, including settlements on Crete. The mountain literally tore itself apart, left a bay where there used to be solid land. The power unleashed that day was beyond anything humans can comprehend, the anger of the earth itself made manifest." Icarus shivered slightly, though whether from the cool air or from imagining such catastrophic power, he couldn't say. The night suddenly felt more vast, more ancient, more filled with forces beyond human control. They were two small beings crossing an immense darkness, held aloft by feathers and will and the accumulated knowledge of a master craftsman. It was humbling and exhilarating in equal measure, this feeling of being simultaneously insignificant and capable of achieving the impossible. They flew on through the deepest part of the night, the hours when even the stars seemed to slow in their wheeling, when time itself felt different, stretched and compressed at once. This was the sacred time, the liminal space between yesterday and tomorrow, between darkness and light, when the world was at its quietest and anything felt possible. Into the deep night. The rhythms of night flight revealed themselves slowly to Icarus as the hours passed, as the initial excitement and adrenaline gradually gave way to a steadier state of focus and awareness. He found that flying through darkness required a different kind of attention than flying by day, a different way of processing information and making decisions. By day, as he'd learned during his practice sessions from the tower, vision was the primary sense, the one you relied on most heavily. You could see the ground approaching, could judge height and speed visually, could spot obstacles and opportunities far in advance. But at night, with only starlight to see by, vision became less reliable, less dominant. Other senses moved to the foreground, became more important. Touch, for instance. Icarus became acutely aware of every sensation against his skin, the pressure of air flowing past his face, the temperature differences that indicated changes in altitude or proximity to rising currents, the subtle vibrations transmitted through the wing harness that told him about turbulence or smooth air ahead. His fingertips on the control ropes became extraordinarily sensitive, able to detect the slightest change in tension that indicated a shift in wing angle or air pressure against the feather surfaces. Hearing, too, became more important in darkness. The sound of wind flowing over the wings changed character depending on flight conditions. Smooth, laminar flow made a steady rushing whisper, like water flowing over smooth stones. Turbulent air created a more chaotic sound, a fluttering or rattling that served as a warning to adjust course or altitude. He could hear his father's wings nearby, could judge Daedalus's position and state even without looking, just by the quality of the sound they made. And there was a sense he'd never really paid attention to before, what his father called proprioception, the body's innate awareness of its position in space, the feeling of balance and orientation that came from organs in the inner ear and from signals sent by muscles and joints. In darkness, when visual cues were limited, this sense became crucial. Icarus learned to trust the feeling in his gut that told him if he was climbing or descending, the sensation of acceleration that indicated changes in speed, the subtle pressures on his body that revealed his orientation relative to the invisible ground below. The night was not uniform in its darkness, he discovered. It had textures and variations, moments of deeper shadow and moments of relative brightness. When they passed under thicker concentrations of stars, when the Milky Way was directly overhead, there was more light to see by, enough that he could make out the foam on wave crests below and could see his father's form in reasonable detail. But there were also patches where clouds obscured the stars, though thankfully not many on this clear night, and in those darker spaces he relied entirely on feel and sound and that inner sense of balance. They spoke little during these deep night hours, both father and son conserving energy and attention for the task of flight. But occasionally, Daedalus would call out observations or instructions, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet air. "There's rougher air ahead," he might say, having spotted some sign that Icarus hadn't yet learned to recognize. "You'll feel it in about 30 seconds. Don't fight it, remember? Flex with the movements, stay loose in the harness, let the wings do the work." And sure enough, Icarus would feel the air change character, would feel his wings begin to bounce and shift in response to turbulence, invisible eddies and currents that grabbed at the feathers and tried to push him off course. But he did as his father instructed, staying relaxed in the harness, making only the minimum corrections needed to maintain roughly the right heading, letting the wings flex and adjust on their own rather than trying to force them to stay rigid. The turbulence would pass after a minute or two, and they'd return to smooth air, and Icarus would marvel at how his father had known it was coming, what signs had revealed its approach. "How did you know?" he asked during one of these moments. "The temperature changed slightly," Daedalus explained. "Got a bit warmer. That usually means you're approaching a boundary between air masses, and boundaries create turbulence as the different masses mix. Also, I could hear it in the sound of the air, a change in the way it was moving. These things take time to learn to notice, but with experience, they become obvious." Experience. That was what Icarus was gaining with every minute of flight, every mile traveled. Knowledge that couldn't be taught with words, only earned through doing, through living through situations and learning from them. He was adding to his understanding constantly, each challenge teaching him something new about the art and science of flight. Around what must have been 3 or 4 hours into their journey, though time was hard to judge with any accuracy in the dark, they encountered their most significant challenge yet. The wind, which had been steady and favorable from the south, pushing them northwest exactly as they wanted to go, began to shift. It grew stronger, more erratic, coming now from the southwest rather than directly from behind them. This change in wind direction meant they had to adjust their heading, had to angle slightly more to the right to compensate for the sideways push they were receiving. But it also meant more turbulence, more active flying required, more concentration and energy expenditure. The easy gliding of the earlier hours gave way to constant small adjustments, constant attention to maintaining course despite the wind trying to blow them off track. Icarus felt his arms and shoulders beginning to tire, the muscles burning slightly from the sustained effort of making these corrections. His hands were cramping from gripping the control ropes, his fingers stiffening in the cool night air. This was the moment his father had warned him about, the point where fatigue would start to become a factor, where his body would begin to protest the prolonged exertion. "Father," he called out, not wanting to admit weakness, but knowing it was important to be honest about his condition. "My arms are getting tired." "I know," Daedalus replied, and there was understanding in his voice rather than criticism. "Mine are too. We've been flying for several hours now, and we're not accustomed to this sustained effort. We need to find a thermal and rest." They began scanning the night around them, looking for any sign of rising air. The problem was that thermals were harder to spot at night, without the visual cues that helped during daylight flying. But Daedalus had taught Icarus what to look for: areas where the air felt slightly warmer, places where birds might be circling even at night, taking advantage of the lift. "There," Daedalus said, after a few minutes of searching, banking slightly to the right. "Do you feel that? The air just got warmer." Icarus adjusted his course to follow his father, and yes, he could feel it. A distinct change in temperature against his face, a warmth that stood out against the general coolness of the night air. They banked more sharply, beginning to circle, and immediately felt the lift, felt themselves being pushed gently upward by invisible hands. They spiraled higher within the thermal, and Icarus felt his arms and shoulders beginning to recover. The circular flight required minimal control input, just small adjustments to stay within the column of rising air, and that reduced workload gave his tired muscles a chance to rest. They climbed for perhaps 10 minutes, gaining several hundred feet of altitude, and by the time the thermal weakened and they leveled out to resume their northwest heading, Icarus felt refreshed, ready to continue. "Better?" Daedalus asked. "Much better," Icarus confirmed, flexing his fingers to work out the remaining stiffness. "Thank you for knowing when to stop." "That's part of being a good flyer," his father said. "Knowing your limits, knowing when to push through discomfort and when to rest. We have many hours still ahead of us, and we need to pace ourselves. There's no shame in acknowledging fatigue. The shame would be in ignoring it until it causes a mistake." They flew on, and the night continued its slow progression toward dawn. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, Polaris remaining fixed as all the others rotated around it, marking the passage of time in the angles and positions of constellations. Icarus found himself becoming hypnotized by the rhythm of flight, by the constant small movements required to maintain course, by the whisper of wind over feathers and the sensation of air holding him aloft. His mind began to wander slightly, though never so much that he lost focus on the essential task of staying in the air. He thought about the tower they'd left behind, wondered if the guards had discovered their absence yet, or if they would sleep soundly until dawn, never suspecting that their prisoners had simply flown away. He thought about King Minos, about how the king would react when he learned that his prized architect had escaped, that the man who knew all the secrets of the labyrinth was now beyond his reach. Would Minos be angry? Sad? Would he send ships to search for them? Or would he accept the loss and move on? He thought about Athens, the city his father had told him about, but that he'd never seen, the city where Daedalus had been born and where they might eventually settle once they felt safe from Minos's reach. He tried to imagine walking through streets he'd never known, seeing buildings his father had described, but that existed for him only in words and imagination. What would it be like to be truly free, to go where he wanted, to see new places and meet new people? And he thought about these wings, these incredible creations that were carrying them across the sea. Would anyone believe their story when they told it? Would people think they were making it up, that human flight was impossible, and they must be lying or exaggerating some other method of escape? Would his father build more wings, teach others to fly? Or would these be the only pair ever created, unique artifacts of a unique moment in time? Icarus, his father's voice pulled him from his reverie. Look ahead, do you see that? Icarus focused his attention forward, scanning the horizon. At first he saw nothing unusual, just the same darkness they'd been flying through for hours. But then he spotted it, a faint lightening of the sky far ahead, the barest suggestion that the absolute black of night might be starting to give way to something else. Dawn is approaching, Daedalus said, and there was satisfaction in his voice mixed with renewed alertness. We've flown through most of the night. We're more than halfway to Sicily. But now we enter the most dangerous phase of our journey. As the sun rises, the air will begin to change, become less predictable, will be more visible to anyone who looks up, and we'll need to be very careful about the sun's position. Icarus felt a mix of emotions at this news. Relief that they'd made it this far, that they were past the halfway point. Pride that his strength and skill had been sufficient to carry him through the long night. But also renewed nervousness about the challenges still ahead, about flying in daylight, about navigating the changing conditions that dawn would bring. "Are you ready?" Daedalus asked. Icarus checked himself. His arms and shoulders were tired, but still functional. His hands still had feeling and strength. His mind was alert despite the hours of flying. He was thirsty, yes, and hungry, but those were manageable discomforts. The wings felt solid and responsive, showing no signs of damage or deterioration. Everything was as good as could be expected at this point in their journey. "I'm ready," he said, and meant it. "Then let's fly toward the dawn," Daedalus said, banking slightly to adjust their heading. "Let's finish what we started." The changing light. The transformation from deep night to early dawn was not sudden, but gradual. A slow awakening of the world that happened in stages, each stage bringing its own beauty and its own challenges. It began with the faintest softening of the darkness in the east, a subtle lightening of the black sky to the deepest navy blue. Most people watching from the ground wouldn't have noticed it yet, wouldn't have seen any difference from true night. But to Icarus and Daedalus, who had been staring at darkness for so many hours, the change was unmistakable. The stars in that eastern direction began to lose a fraction of their brilliance. Their light, overwhelmed by something brighter, approaching just below the horizon. The sea below remained black for now, indistinguishable from the sky in the darkness, creating the odd sensation of flying through an endless void, suspended in nothingness with only the stars above to provide any sense of orientation. "Remember what I taught you about the sun," Daedalus said, his voice taking on a more serious tone now that dawn was approaching. "As it rises, the air will warm unevenly. The sea will heat more slowly than any land we pass near, and that difference in heating rates will create wind shear, sudden changes in wind speed and direction at the boundaries between differently heated air masses. You must be ready for them, ready to adjust quickly but smoothly. Don't overcorrect. If you feel a sudden change in wind, make a small adjustment, assess the result, then adjust further if needed. Icarus nodded, his hands tightening slightly on the control ropes, his full attention returning to the task of flight after the slightly dreamlike state he'd fallen into during the deepest part of the night. He was tired, deeply tired, in a way he'd never experienced before, a fatigue that went beyond just muscle soreness into something more fundamental. Every part of his body ached. His eyes felt gritty and dry from hours of staring into darkness and wind. His throat was parched, but his mind was still sharp, still focused, and that was what mattered most. The sky continued to brighten, moving through subtle shades of blue, each one slightly lighter than the last. Deep navy gave way to royal blue, which gradually softened to a lighter azure. The stars began to disappear, the dimmer ones first, winking out as if someone was extinguishing candles one by one across the heavens. The brightest stars and the planets held on longer, Venus brilliant in the east, Mars a reddish point in the south. But even they would eventually surrender to the approaching day. The horizon became a clearly defined line now, separating the dark sea from the lightening sky. It was strange to see that line after hours of darkness, to have a clear reference point for down and up, when before there had been only stars above and vague darkness below. And then Icarus saw something that made his heart leap with hope and excitement. Land. It was distant still, a dark smudge on the horizon to the northwest, barely visible in the pre-dawn light, but it was unmistakably land. Hills or mountains rising from the sea. Sicily, their destination. Freedom made manifest in stone and soil. "I see it," he called to his father, unable to keep the excitement from his voice. "Land, ahead of us." "I see it too," Daedalus replied, and there was relief in his voice, though also continued caution. "But we're not there yet, Icarus. We still have perhaps 2 or 3 hours of flying ahead of us, and as I warned you, the sun will break the horizon soon, and we need to be extremely mindful of its position and its effects. This is when the air becomes most unstable, when the temperature differences between night and day create the most challenging conditions." As if responding to his words, the very first edge of the sun appeared on the eastern horizon, a brilliant point of light that seemed to explode into being rather than gradually appearing. The change was dramatic. One moment there was only the pre-dawn glow, the next moment there was actual sunlight, golden and warm and impossibly bright after the long darkness. The sun's rays touched the highest clouds far above them first, igniting them in brilliant shades of pink and orange and crimson, painting the sky with colors that seemed almost unreal in their intensity. Icarus had seen sunrises before, of course, countless times from the tower in Crete, but never like this, never from above, never as a participant in the dawn rather than merely an observer. The beauty of it was almost overwhelming, made him want to stop flying and just hover in place to watch, though of course that was impossible, with wings that required constant forward motion to stay aloft. The sun rose slowly, as it always does, but from their vantage point, it seemed to climb more quickly, a blazing disk of gold lifting itself from the sea. Its light spread across the water like liquid fire, transforming the dark ocean into a shifting pattern of blues and greens and golds, each wave catching and reflecting the light in slightly different ways, creating a constantly changing mosaic that was mesmerizing to watch. The world, which had been a place of darkness and stars for so many hours, became a place of light and color. And with that light came warmth, the sun's heat touching Icarus's face and hands, warming skin that had grown cold during the long night flight. It felt wonderful, that warmth, chasing away the chill and the fatigue, filling him with renewed energy. But Icarus, tired as he was, remembered his father's warnings. He looked at the sun, gauged its angle and position, and deliberately adjusted his flight path so that it was behind him and slightly to his left rather than ahead or to his right. He would not fly toward it. He would not let its light blind him or let himself be distracted by its beauty in ways that might compromise his navigation. And most importantly, he would not let its heat become a problem for the wings. "Good," Daedalus said, noting his son's careful positioning relative to the sun. "You're learning to think ahead, to anticipate challenges before they become problems. That's the mark of a true flyer, someone who doesn't just react to situations, but prepares for them before they arise." The warmth of the sun felt glorious on Icarus's back after the coolness of the night, but he also became aware of how the air around him was beginning to change. The steady, predictable winds of the deep night were giving way to something more chaotic, more unstable. The sun's heat was starting to create convection currents, columns of air that rose from areas heated by the dawn light and cooled in other places, creating a complex three-dimensional pattern of movement that required much more active flying to navigate safely. True to his father's prediction, they began to encounter wind shear, sudden changes in wind speed or direction that required quick adjustments to maintain stable flight. But Icarus's nighttime training served him well. He'd learned to read the subtle signs in the air, to feel changes coming before they fully manifested. Each time he encountered shear, he was ready for it, adjusting smoothly and maintaining his course without overcorrecting or panicking. He felt his confidence growing with each successfully navigated challenge. Yes, he was tired. Yes, his muscles ached. Yes, this was the hardest physical thing he'd ever done. But he was succeeding. The wings were working perfectly. His training had prepared him well. They were going to make it. Sicily grew larger on the horizon with each passing minute, its mountains becoming more distinct, details emerging from the general mass of land. Icarus could see the coastline now, could make out valleys between the peaks, could even spot what might be settlements or farms on the slopes, tiny geometric patterns of cultivated land standing out against the wild mountainsides. They were perhaps an hour away now, maybe less if the wind held favorable. But as they drew closer to land, they also entered more complex airspace. The mountains created their own wind patterns, deflecting the prevailing winds, creating updrafts on their windward sides where wind was forced up the slopes, and creating turbulence on their lee sides where the wind spilled over the peaks in chaotic swirls. The transition from flying over the smooth, relatively simple environment of open ocean to flying near the much more complex environment of mountainous terrain required increased attention and skill. Daedalus led the way, his experience showing as he found the safest paths through the shifting air. He would climb when they encountered strong updrafts, gaining altitude that they could then trade for forward progress. He would bank smoothly around areas where the air looked turbulent, reading signs in the movement of clouds and birds and in subtle color changes in the water below that indicated rough conditions. His movements were efficient, economical, wasting no energy on unnecessary maneuvers. Icarus followed his father's lead, trusting in Daedalus's greater wisdom and experience. And gradually, through careful, navigation, and skilled flying. They approached the Sicilian coast. The sun was well above the horizon now, perhaps 2 or 3 hours into its daily arc, and the day was fully established. The stars were gone, hidden by the brightness of the sky. The air had warmed significantly, though the wax in the wings remained firm enough to maintain their structural integrity, just as Daedalus had calculated it would. The wings had proven themselves through a full night of flight and into morning, had carried them across vast expanses of ocean, had turned an impossible dream into reality. They crossed the coastline, those great wings carrying them over the breaking waves and onto Sicilian soil, or rather, Sicilian air above Sicilian soil. The mountains rose below them, covered in forests and scrub, dotted with small villages and farm fields. Smoke rose from morning cooking fires, a familiar and welcoming sight after so many hours over empty ocean. People were beginning their day down there, farmers heading to fields, shepherds leading flocks to pasture, bakers firing their ovens, having no idea that 2 men were flying overhead in wings of feathers and wax. "We're almost there," Daedalus called out, his voice containing both relief and continued focus. "There's a valley ahead, wide and flat, where we can land safely. Can you make it? How are you feeling?" Icarus checked himself honestly. He was exhausted, running on fumes and determination, and the sight of freedom so close ahead. But he was also still functional. His arms and shoulders were screaming with fatigue. His hands were cramping around the control ropes. His eyes were burning. His throat was desperately dry. But he could still fly. The end was in sight. He could make it. "I can make it," he replied, putting every ounce of confidence he could muster into his voice. "Good man," Daedalus said with obvious pride. "Just a little longer now. Stay with me." They began their descent, angling down gradually, losing altitude at a controlled rate that would bring them to the valley floor without requiring any sudden or dangerous maneuvers. Daedalus demonstrated the technique, pulling back slightly on his wing controls to increase drag, tilting the wings more vertically to catch more air resistance, slowing their forward speed while maintaining enough lift to avoid dropping like a stone. Icarus matched him, feeling how the wings wanted to stall if he slowed too much, finding that delicate balance where he descended steadily but remained in complete control. The ground rose up to meet them, details becoming clearer with each moment. Individual trees became distinguishable from the general forest. Rocks and paths emerged from the landscape. They could see people now, farmers in their fields who stopped their work to stare upward in amazement at the impossible sight of 2 men flying like birds toward the earth, their great wings spread wide, descending from the morning sky. Lower they came, and lower, still, Daedalus leading them toward a broad meadow that would serve as their landing field. The grass below was green and looked soft, perfect for what would be their first real landing after so many hours aloft, after crossing the sea and flying through the night and navigating the challenging transition from darkness to dawn. At 100 feet above the ground, Daedalus called out final instructions, his voice steady despite the fatigue he must be feeling. "Remember your training. Flare at the last moment. Keep your knees bent. And don't forget to pull the release on your harness after you land so the wings don't drag you if the wind catches them." Icarus's heart was pounding, adrenaline flooding his system one final time, but his hands were steady on the controls despite their exhaustion. He'd practiced this dozens of times from the tower, but never after flying for so many hours, never while this tired, never with so much significance attached to the outcome. But his training was solid, his skills were sound, he could do this. The landing 50 feet above the meadow, and Icarus could see every detail now. The individual blades of grass, swaying gently in the morning breeze, a rabbit bounding away in fright at their approach, wildflowers scattered through the grass like colored jewels, a large rock that he would need to avoid. Close enough now that a mistake would hurt, would possibly break bones, but not so far that it would necessarily be fatal if something went wrong. 25 feet. Daedalus was just ahead and slightly below, his wings spread to their absolute maximum extent, his body positioning perfect as he prepared for touchdown. Icarus matched his father's configuration, pulling back on the control ropes to increase the wings' angle of attack, feeling them catch more air, feeling his downward momentum begin to bleed away. 15 feet, 10 feet. The grass was rushing up now, close enough to see insects flying among the flowers, close enough to smell the earth and vegetation, close enough that the ground had stopped being an abstract concept and become an immediate reality. 5 feet, and Icarus made his final adjustment, flaring the wings completely, angling them almost vertical, catching as much air as possible, using it like a parachute to scrub away the last of his descending speed. And then Daedalus's feet touched the grass, and the older man was running, his legs pumping as he bled off his remaining forward momentum, his wings still spread behind him, catching the air and providing some resistance. 3 running steps, 4, and then he was slowing, coming to a stop, immediately folding his wings and turning to watch his son's landing, ready to offer help if needed. Icarus felt his own feet touch the earth a heartbeat later, felt solid ground beneath him for the first time in how many hours? 7? 8? More? The exact number didn't matter. What mattered was that the landing was good, the impact gentle and controlled, his legs absorbing the shock perfectly. He ran forward just as his father had done, 3 steps, 4, feeling the wings tugging at him as they caught the wind, pulling the release cord on his harness and feeling the tension immediately drop away as the wings separated from the harness, falling away to lie folded on the grass beside where he came to a stop. And then he was standing still, on solid ground, in Sicily, free. His legs trembled beneath him, partially from fatigue and partially from the strange feeling of standing still after so many hours of motion. The world felt oddly stable after the constant movement of flight, oddly quiet after the hours of wind rushing past his ears. He looked down at his hands and saw they were shaking slightly, saw blisters forming where the control ropes had rubbed against his palms despite the calluses he'd developed during training. For a long moment, neither father nor son moved. They simply stood there in the meadow, breathing hard, their legs unsteady, the wings lying on the grass beside them like discarded chrysalises, symbols of a transformation that had just been completed. Around them, farmers were approaching cautiously, wonder and uncertainty mixing on their faces as they tried to understand what they'd just witnessed, tried to reconcile the impossible with what their eyes had clearly shown them. Then Daedalus began to laugh. It started as a quiet chuckle, almost incredulous, then grew into a full belly laugh, the kind of laugh that comes from deep relief and profound joy, and the release of tension that had been building for months. He walked, no, staggered, over to his son and pulled him into an embrace, holding him tightly, and Icarus could feel his father trembling with emotion and exhaustion. "You did it," Daedalus said, his voice thick with emotion, words half choked by the tears that were running down his face. tears of joy and relief and overwhelming pride. You flew perfectly, Icarus. Every adjustment, every decision, everything I taught you, you learned it all and applied it flawlessly. I am so proud of you, my son, so incredibly proud. Icarus couldn't speak. His own tears were flowing freely now, tears of exhaustion and relief and overwhelming happiness. He'd flown. He'd actually flown through the night, across vast expanses of ocean, through darkness and wind and changing air, navigating by stars and feel and hard-won skill. And he'd landed safely on the other side. He was free. They were both free. The farmers had reached them now, forming a cautious semicircle, their initial fear giving way to amazement. One of them, an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes, stepped forward. "Are you gods?" he asked in Greek, though with a heavy Sicilian accent that made some of the words hard to understand. "Or spirits? We saw you flying like great birds, like eagles, but you are clearly men. How is this possible?" Daedalus, recovering his composure, wiped his eyes and smiled at the farmer. "We are men," he said, his voice still rough with emotion but growing steadier. "Just men who have learned to fly, who have built wings that work with nature rather than fighting against it. I am Daedalus, a craftsman from Athens, though imprisoned on Crete, and this is my son, Icarus. We've escaped from the tower of King Minos, flown through the night across the sea to reach your shores. We seek sanctuary here in Sicily, protection from Minos's reach, a place where we can live in freedom." The farmer's eyes widened even further. Daedalus? The Daedalus? The one who built the great labyrinth? When Daedalus nodded, the man immediately bowed deeply. "You are known here, master craftsman. Your reputation has spread far beyond Crete, far beyond the Aegean. Stories of your genius have reached even our small corner of the world. You will find welcome in Sicily. Of that, I am absolutely certain. Come, let me take you to the nearest town, where you can rest and refresh yourselves. And please, you must tell us how you accomplished this miracle of flight, how you defied the laws that have bound mankind to the earth since the beginning of time." As they walked toward the town, Icarus, carrying his folded wings carefully over his shoulder, too precious to leave behind despite their weight, he looked back once at the path they'd flown. The sun was bright in the eastern sky now, climbing toward noon, casting strong light and sharp shadows across the landscape. In the traditional tale, in the story that would be told for thousands of years in the future, this would be the moment of his downfall, the moment when the sun's heat melted the wax and sent him plummeting to his death in the sea, his name becoming forever associated with hubris and tragic overreaching. But that was not this tale. That was not what had happened. In this version of events, his father's engineering had triumphed over the challenges. The careful design, the redundant attachment systems, the patient training, the wisdom that understood you didn't fight against nature, but worked with it, all of these had combined to achieve something that had seemed impossible. They had flown, truly flown, and they had survived. And as Icarus walked through the Sicilian meadow, his wings over his shoulder, his father beside him, and freedom stretching out before them like an uncharted sky, he thought about what they'd accomplished and what it meant not just for them, but for the future, for the idea of what humans might achieve when intelligence and courage and careful preparation all aligned. Reflections on wings and wisdom over the following days and weeks as Daedalus and Icarus rested and recovered in Sicily. as they were welcomed by the local king who had heard of Daedalus's fame and was honored to offer sanctuary, as they told their story again and again to amazed listeners who could hardly believe such a feat was possible. Icarus had time to reflect deeply on what he'd learned during that extraordinary night. The traditional story of Icarus, the version that would be told for thousands of years after these events, would be a story of hubris and tragedy. A cautionary tale about a boy who flew too high, who ignored his father's wise counsel, who paid the ultimate price for his arrogance and disobedience. It would be a warning against excess and overreach, a reminder of human limitations, a tale that taught the importance of moderation and humility. And that story had value, certainly. There were important lessons in it about respecting boundaries, about listening to those who know better, about the dangers of letting excitement override good judgment. Those lessons were worth preserving and teaching. But this story, this true account of the night he never fell, carried different lessons, perhaps more subtle, but also more valuable, precisely because they acknowledged the full complexity of the challenge, rather than reducing it to a simple moral about flying too high. The first lesson, the one that Icarus thought about most often, was about preparation. Daedalus had not simply built wings and hoped for the best, had not relied on luck or divine favor or raw courage to see them through. He'd studied birds for months, observing every detail of how they flew. He'd designed the wings with meticulous care, incorporating redundant systems and safety margins. He'd tested every element thoroughly before risking their lives. He'd built in flexibility and adjustability, rather than rigid structures that couldn't adapt to changing conditions. The wings had succeeded not because of luck or because the gods smiled upon them, but because of careful, patient, methodical engineering. Because a master craftsman had brought all his skills and knowledge to bear on a seemingly impossible problem and had solved it through intelligence and hard work. This lesson extended beyond flight. Whatever you attempted in life, whatever challenge you faced, success came from preparation, from doing the work beforehand, from understanding the forces involved, from building in safety margins and redundancies, from testing and refining until everything was as perfect as human skill could make it. The second lesson was about training and incremental progress. Icarus had not simply strapped on the wings and leaped from the tower on that final night. He'd practiced for weeks and months, building skills gradually, learning the basics before attempting anything advanced. By the time they made their actual escape, flying had become second nature to him, something his body knew how to do without conscious thought. This was how mastery was achieved in anything, through patient, incremental progress, through thousands of small improvements, each building on the last, through the willingness to start with fundamentals and only advance when those fundamentals were solid. There were no shortcuts to true skill, no way to skip the boring parts and jump straight to the exciting culmination. The boring parts were where the real learning happened. The third lesson, one that had saved his life multiple times during the flight, was about working with natural forces rather than fighting against them. The wings succeeded because they were designed to harness the power of wind and air currents rather than trying to overcome those forces through brute strength. When they encountered thermals, they used them to gain altitude. When they faced turbulence, they flexed with it rather than fighting it. When wind shear threatened to throw them off course, they made small adjustments to accommodate it rather than trying to force the wings to maintain a rigid path. This principle applied to so much of life beyond flight. The most successful people, weren't always the strongest or the most forceful, but rather those who understood how to work with the circumstances they faced, how to redirect challenges into opportunities, how to flow around obstacles rather than smashing into them. Water wore away stone not through force, but through persistence and adaptability, following the paths of least resistance and gradually reshaping the world. The fourth lesson was about listening to wisdom. Icarus had succeeded because he'd listened to his father's teachings, because he'd taken the warnings seriously and applied them thoughtfully. The sun was indeed dangerous, not in the dramatic way that later tales would describe, with wings melting instantly, but in the subtle ways that Daedalus had predicted, creating unstable air, warming the wax enough to change the wing's responsiveness, providing distractions that could compromise focus and judgment. By respecting those dangers and planning around them, by flying at night when the sun wasn't a factor and only transitioning to daylight when they were close to their destination, they'd avoided problems before they could arise. Wisdom, accumulated through experience and passed down from teacher to student, from parent to child, was a precious gift that should be honored and applied, not dismissed as excessive caution or outdated thinking. And perhaps the most important lesson, the one that Icarus would carry with him for the rest of his life and eventually pass on to his own children, was about the difference between recklessness and courage. The traditional story cast Icarus as reckless, as someone whose lack of restraint led to tragedy. But the true story revealed something more nuanced. Recklessness was flying too high simply because it felt good, because the thrill overwhelmed all judgment and consideration of consequences. Recklessness was ignoring warnings and preparation in favor of impulsive action. Recklessness was confusing excitement with wisdom, confusing the rush of adrenaline with genuine confidence. But courage, true courage, was facing genuine challenges with skill and determination. It was acknowledging the risks while still moving forward, prepared and trained and ready. It was feeling fear, but not letting that fear paralyze you or prevent you from attempting something worthwhile. It was the turbulence they'd flown through, the exhaustion they'd pushed past, the moment when his arms were cramping and tired, but he'd continued flying because stopping wasn't an option, and he had the skills to continue safely. In the traditional story, Icarus was a cautionary figure, a symbol of what not to do. But in this true account, Icarus was something better. He was an example of what humans could achieve when intelligence and patience and respect for natural forces combined with courage and determination. When wisdom guided action rather than either being paralyzed by fear or rushing forward with blind recklessness. Word of their flight spread quickly, far beyond Sicily. Within months, people throughout the Greek world had heard the story of Daedalus and his son, who had flown across the sea on wings of feathers and wax. Some believed it, especially those who knew Daedalus's reputation and could imagine his genius achieving such a feat. Others were skeptical, thinking it must be exaggerated or metaphorical, that they must have escaped by boat, and the wings were just a decorative detail added to make the story more interesting. But those who came to see the wings themselves, to examine them and watch demonstrations of their capabilities, came away believers. The wings existed. They worked. Daedalus had achieved the impossible. Many people asked him to build more wings, to teach them to fly. Daedalus was courteous but firm in his refusals. The wings required not just construction, but extensive training. They demanded respect and skill. They were not toys or shortcuts or simple tools that anyone could pick up and use. They were complex instruments that required a deep understanding of forces and materials and flight dynamics to use safely. Perhaps someday, he would tell those who asked, when humanity is ready, when we've developed the knowledge and discipline required to handle this responsibility, perhaps then flight will become common. But for now, these wings remain unique, a proof of what's possible, but not yet something that should be widely distributed. But he did begin to write down what he'd learned, creating detailed drawings and notes that explain the principles of flight, the design considerations for the wings, the training required to fly them safely. He documented everything meticulously, not because he planned to share it immediately, but because he understood that knowledge should be preserved for future generations. Perhaps in 100 years, or 1,000, someone would rediscover these principles and build upon them, creating better wings, safer designs, methods of flight that would eventually make the sky as accessible to humans as the sea had become. Icarus, for his part, found that he missed flying deeply. The night flight had been grueling, yes, exhausting, and dangerous, and requiring every ounce of focus and strength he possessed. But it had also been the most alive he'd ever felt, the most fully present in his body and mind, the most connected to the world around him. The memory of it stayed with him constantly, calling to him. Sometimes, with his father's permission, and always with appropriate caution, he would take the wings out and make short flights over the Sicilian hills. He never went high, never pushed the limits, never forgot the lessons learned during that crossing from Crete. Just gentle glides over familiar terrain, feeling the wind under the wings and remembering that incredible night when they'd crossed the sea. People would see him sometimes, flying in the evening sky, and point and wonder. A new kind of legend grew around him, different from the tragic version that would later emerge. He became known as Icarus the Wise, Icarus the Skilled, Icarus who had learned to fly and survived, who had mastered the sky through patience and training rather than being destroyed by it through recklessness and pride. And on certain clear nights, when the stars were bright and the wind was favorable, and the longing became too strong to ignore, Icarus would fly high above the hills, high enough to see the curve of the earth below and the vast sweep of stars above. He would remember that first flight, remember the darkness and the stars, and his father's voice calling out instructions and encouragement. He would remember the feeling of being suspended between sea and sky, held aloft by feathers and will and knowledge. But most of all, he would remember the lesson his father had taught him, the one that had saved his life and made everything possible. That true mastery came not from fighting against the world, but from understanding it deeply enough to move through it with grace. That the greatest achievements came not from reckless daring, but from careful preparation combined with courage. That wisdom and wonder were not opposites, but partners, each enriching the other, closing reflections for dreamers. And so we come to the end of this tale, this alternate version of a story you thought you knew. The story of Daedalus and Icarus, in its traditional form, has been told for thousands of years. It appears in Greek and Roman texts, in medieval manuscripts illuminated by monks' hands, in Renaissance paintings that hang in museums, in modern books and films and retellings of every kind. The image of Icarus falling from the sky, his melted wings trailing behind him, has become one of the most enduring and recognizable symbols in all of Western culture, a universal warning about the dangers of hubris and overreach. But tonight, we've explored a different possibility, a different path the story might have taken. a version where wisdom triumphed over tragedy, where careful preparation overcame impossible odds, where a son listened to his father, and both found freedom not through luck, but through skill and knowledge and respect for the forces they worked with. Is this version true? Did it really happen this way, somewhere in the branching possibilities of time and story? Mythology is a strange thing, occupying a space between history and imagination, between what was and what might have been. The Greeks themselves understood this, treasured their myths not because they were factually accurate records of events, but because they carried deeper truths about human nature, about the world, about the challenges we face and the ways we respond to them. Perhaps the traditional story of Icarus's fall carries an important truth about human nature, about our tendency toward excess, our need for humility, the dangers of ignoring good advice. That's valuable. That's worth preserving and retelling and learning from. But perhaps this alternate version carries its own truth, equally valuable but different in character. A truth about human potential, about what we can achieve when we combine intelligence with courage, when we respect the forces of nature while still daring to work with them, when we listen to accumulated wisdom while still having the courage to try something new. Both versions can be true in their own way. Both teach us something important. And in a world where we've actually achieved human flight, where airplanes carry millions of people through the sky every day, where astronauts have walked on the moon and probes have visited distant planets, perhaps this hopeful version resonates differently than it might have to the ancient Greeks who first told the tale. We have learned to fly, we humans, not with wax and feathers, but with metal and fuel and computers, using the same fundamental principles that Daedalus would have understood: lift and drag, thrust and weight, the careful balance of forces that allows something heavier than air to rise into the sky and stay there. Every airplane is, in some sense, a descendant of those mythical wings, a proof that the impossible can become possible through patient work and clear thinking. And every person who designs aircraft, every pilot who guides a plane safely through the night sky, every passenger who looks out a window at the stars above and the earth below, is carrying forward the legacy of this story, whether they know it or not. But we've also learned, sometimes through tragedy, the lessons that Daedalus taught his son in this version of the tale. We've learned that flight demands respect, that it requires extensive training, that you cannot simply throw yourself into the air and hope for the best. The safest pilots, the ones who live long careers and retire peacefully, are not the most daring or aggressive, but the most careful. The ones who check every system, who respect the weather, who know their limits and the limits of their machines, who understand that safety margins exist for good reasons. So perhaps this alternate ending isn't just a pleasant bedtime story, a what if that makes us feel better. Perhaps it's pointing toward a deeper truth about how we should approach any difficult challenge in our lives, with preparation, with respect for the forces involved, with willingness to learn and adapt, with the patience to develop skills gradually rather than rushing forward recklessly. As you drift towards sleep now, as this long story comes to its close, and you feel the weight of drowsiness pulling you down toward dreams, imagine yourself in Icarus's place one final time. Feel the wings on your back, real and solid, the product of months of patient work. Feel the harness around your shoulders, distributing the weight, holding everything secure. Feel the control ropes in your hands, responsive to your slightest touch. You've trained for this. You've prepared. You understand what needs to be done. You stand on that tower roof under the stars, the night wind cool against your face, the sea stretching dark and vast before you. Freedom waits out there, across the water, if you have the courage and skill to reach for it. Behind you lies imprisonment, however comfortable. Ahead lies uncertainty, challenge, but also possibility. You spread your wings, and they catch the starlight, and you step forward. Feel the moment when the wings catch the air. Feel yourself rising instead of falling. Feel the wind holding you up. Feel the incredible sensation of flight. Cross the dark sea in your mind. Navigate by the stars. Feel the exhaustion in your muscles and the determination in your heart. See the sunrise painting the clouds in gold. Glimpse the distant shore growing closer with every moment. And finally, feel your feet touch solid ground in a new land. Feel the wings fold away. Feel the relief and triumph and profound gratitude for the wisdom that saw you through, for the training that prepared you, for the intelligence that designed wings that worked not through force, but through understanding. Let this story carry you into sleep tonight. Let it remind you that sometimes the old stories can have new endings, that tragedy is not always inevitable, that with wisdom and preparation and respect for the forces we face, we can achieve things that seem impossible. Sleep well, travelers. May your own flights, whatever form they take, be guided by wisdom and carried by favorable winds. May you navigate by the stars and land safely on distant shores. May you remember that the greatest achievements come not from reckless daring, but from careful preparation, patient training, and deep respect for the world around you. May you fly through your dreams tonight, held aloft by wonder and wisdom working together. Good night. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through an alternate mythology, this exploration of what might have been. If you enjoyed this reimagining of a classic tale, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Mythic Nightfall for more explorations of ancient stories told with new voices and fresh perspectives. Leave a comment and let me know which myth you'd like to hear reimagined next time. There are so many stories to explore, so many possibilities to consider. Until tomorrow night, when we'll gather again around the fire of story and imagination, sleep peacefully. The wings are folded away safely. The night is gentle, and in dreams, we all can fly. Good night and sweet dreams.